Good evening, everyone. My name is John Owen, and I'm privileged to be the chairman of the Frontline Club. And on behalf of Millicent Teasdale, who organizes all of these remarkable events, and Vaughn Smith, who would normally be making the introduction here tonight, I want to welcome you to this very special event. The Frontline Club has been at the very center of the international campaign to try to make sure that Peter Gresta and Bahar Mohamed and Mohamed Fahmy were eventually released, along with Sue Turton, who's also a member of this club and someone who has been also facing the possibility of international arrest. We've had many events organized here, and we have tried to do our very best to make sure that the international world did not forget about what was going on inside these Egyptian jails. And I'm really pleased that finally some kind of justice has been done. We were very proud to have Peter Gresta here when he was released, and of course we were waiting and hoping that we would see the day when we would have in front of us Mohamed Fahmy and Bahar Mohamed. I just want to say before I introduce them that there are still many other activists and journalists languishing in Egyptian prisons. Let's not forget them. Let's not forget the local journalists who continue to try to report on things and get forgotten because we pay sometimes too much attention to the international journalists who are doing their jobs, of course. So find out who those people are and also continue the campaign to make sure they're released. We are very pleased tonight to have Mohamed Fahmy along with Amal Clooney, who has helped secure his release, and we are greatly indebted to you for everything you've done. And who better to guide this evening than the wonderful international correspondent, Lise Doucette of the BBC. Have a very good evening. Thank you for coming.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's fantastic to see such a big turnout here tonight. I think what we'd like to regard is in London, one of the houses of press freedom. And I'd like to begin by saying that when not just a good journalist, but a very good Egyptian-Canadian journalist covered the events that came to be known as the so-called Arab Spring, he must have reported day in, day out about a rallying cry, which was Hurrah, freedom. And little did he know at the time that a few years later, in fact from December 2013, he would begin to long for something called freedom. And I think we are all very privileged tonight to be with Mohamed Fahmy on his first night here in London, his first public appearance since he tasted freedom. Welcome, Mohamed Fahmy.
Thank you so much.
And tonight in our discussion, we will hear about not just his battle for his own freedom, but for his colleagues and his battle which will continue for press freedom for all of those journalists who continue to languish in prison. But we also are very grateful for, if we're going to talk about a battle, his legal weapon, the distinguished human rights activist and lawyer Amal Clooney, and his not-so-secret weapon. In fact, she did become not-so-secret, Marwa Omara, who stood at the prison gates time and time again to call for Mohamed's freedom. We want to welcome you, Marwa, as well tonight. So as difficult as it is to be at the Frontline Club for both Marwa and for Amal, it's much better than standing outside prison gates. Absolutely. And I think we should all clap for ourselves, because I think possibly every single person in this room either taped their mouths, hashtag journalism is not a crime, wrote to your MP, stood up, spoke out for press freedom. So let us pay tribute to all of you here tonight as well. And let's begin. Freedom, what does it feel like?
Well, on my first day today in public outside the Egyptian border, I do feel like I'm born again. And you know, me and Marwa are just so easy to please now. We're walking the streets and we're very euphoric for no reason. So, you know, we're very excited to be here. But today, I just want to mention a very important person in this room, Dominic Kane,
oh, Dominic.
My colleague from Al Jazeera, who The last time I saw him, we were in the Marriott 2 years ago, and
the Marriott cell.
yeah, the Marriott cell. You know, the very dangerous journalists. You know, and terrorists. Yeah, and you know, it's so excited to see him today, and we're gonna have a beer later, but you know, I'm just happy to see him today.
Yes.
Really.
And he's still a wanted man, Dominic. Don't worry, we'll protect you here in Frontline Club.
The next part of the battle.
Yes.
The battle continues.
Yes. The last time we had seen you before the day when you came out was in August, and Amal, you were in the courtroom that day, and everyone expected that that would be the day where the judge would find you and Bahir Mohammed guilty, but you would probably be a one-year sentence, and you'd already served time, so you would taste freedom that day. And I think the world saw pictures of you behind the cage. We saw Marwa in tears. We saw Amal having to field questions from the press about why this verdict had been announced again. What did it feel like, just to contrast, when you went back into prison accused again of spreading false news and being linked to a now banned Islamist group, the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I never ever thought it would happen again. I still, you know, I went that day, I said goodbye to Amal, I'll be back, and I hugged my wife, and I took my mobile and wallet, forgot to give it to her, and I just walked to that cage thinking that in 5 minutes I'll be out. You know, I never thought that would happen, specifically because the technical committee that was appointed by the court presented a report to the judge saying that we did not fabricate any videos. And I know for a fact that we didn't. And so I sort of had more optimism this time around that this retrial would result in a positive verdict, and if it didn't, then it would have been settled due to political reasons. From day one, I've stated that this case had two aspects. It was, you know, the aspect of freedom of speech, where you are silencing 3 recognized journalists, and it had a political aspect, which is an ongoing score-settling battle between Egypt and Al Jazeera, Qatar, the owner of Al Jazeera. So, again, most of the lawyers thought that it would be a time served or a suspended sentence, but it was a real shock for sure.
I would just say not on a legal basis. People said to me as I was walking in, how do you feel? And I could hear people saying, we're cautiously optimistic. And I thought, hang on what basis would we be cautiously optimistic? If you were to look at it from the point of view of the evidence that was presented, you would be wildly optimistic that he would be acquitted, and the others, because there was absolutely no evidence presented in the retrial, just like there was no evidence in the initial trial. The reason I think people said, well, maybe it will be time served, is that would have been a sort of political solution through the courts. And you know what we got was a reduction in the sentence. And actually, when we were in court, we thought that the judge had found that there was a conviction on false news and on a lack of licenses, but had not reconvicted on the basis of terrorism, which was the most absurd charge. But actually, I did, before coming today, reread the 60-page judgment, so I've got it all fresh in my mind. And it was a conviction for terrorism again, and really just on the basis that, well, anyone who works for that channel must therefore be a terrorist, and with no other evidence cited. The kinds of evidence were things like, well, you know, he was the mastermind of the Marriott cell at this hotel, and there were people coming in with handbags and of different nationalities.
Final cut.
And which was my favorite. So in the prosecutor's closing speech, he said, surely anyone who has on their laptop a software called Final Cut Pro must be intent on undermining the security of the state. And we wondered whether that was going to be something that the judgment adopted in its reasoning, and sure enough, Final Cut Pro featured prominently as a basis for conviction.
The final cut into the deep state.
Yeah.
And did you, when you got into prison, how depressed were you, in the sense, did you think that freedom could be imminent as soon as it was?
No, not at all. This time it was much harder because you know, you're revisiting the whole nightmare all over again, and you're back in the cell. It didn't hit me until I was, you know, getting into the prison garb, and then it starts to hit you, and you worry about your family, and people don't realize that, of course, it's hard for any prisoner, but it's even harder for the family because they don't know what you're going through inside. But of course, thanks to all the journalists across the world and the unity that was put behind this cause, it really, really made a difference. And in solitary confinement, you know, you're 1 month, you're inside, you have no sunlight, no way of telling time, but somehow the the advocacy and that was happening outside was slipping through the concrete walls. The guard would come in and say, oh, they're fighting for you in Canada, or there's a protest in London. We're like, okay. So you know now that you're fighting for a bigger cause, and it's not just about you and Peter and Baher. And it was so important the way, you know, the armies of diplomats, the journalists, the NGOs, you know, it was really important, and it has inspired me to do the same as well, basically.
And when you went back in, were you with Baher Mohammed, your Egyptian colleague, who of course left children and his wife behind? He went back into prison the day after he celebrated his son's birthday, who was born when he was in prison.
I call Baher the father of the year. I tell him that if there's an award, you guys should nominate him. He's such a great guy. And yeah, of course, he was with me. He's been with me the whole time. Peter also spent a lot of time together in prison, and you know, it's that brotherhood and bond that we had that kept us going inside that very intense situations and emotional roller coasters all the time. And so yeah, and thankfully we were pardoned, and I believe this pardon came due to a collective effort. But of course the nail in the coffin was Amal's visit to Egypt, and my wife,
Maybe not the best use to turn a phrase there.
And my wife.
But just tell us that day, because some people may have heard the story, but it must be a very extremely sweet moment, the moment that you heard the news, because it was a surprise to everyone, I think.
Marwa was visiting me, and after a family visit, you go back to your cell and you're really depressed, and because you just left your family behind. But as soon as I walked in, our names were being announced on television. And me and Baher couldn't believe it. I mean, we literally danced and hugged, and we did we were so excited, and we started packing, and they just picked us up and they left us on the street with no phone and no money.
And we're
at my old high school, outside the high school. I'm wearing the prison garb, and you know, it was really an emotional. And I do, you know, I'm thankful to the Egyptian government, but I've been invited on Egyptian television shows. I've been interviewed in Egypt before I came, and I mentioned that this pardon comes, the way I see it, is that it's a spirit of reconciliation, and I said that it should be a path for more pardons, and I announced very clearly that there are many more behind bars that have been, you know, they've been bundled in after the security sweeps following the political turmoil, and there are innocent people inside, journalists and others. And again, I've been calling on Egyptian television for that my colleagues should be pardoned. You know, if you pardon, you know, the ringleader, then you should pardon everybody else, right?
Yes.
And you know, yeah.
But let's be clear on what, and I'll bring you in here, Amal, because we discussed this in Cairo during those days of the last courtroom appearance. What does it actually mean in Egyptian law for Mohammed and Baher to be pardoned, because the others are not pardoned yet?
Right.
Does it mean the conviction is wiped, or?
We have asked this question to the Egyptian council, and we've been told that it should mean that your criminal record is expunged. However, I have yet to see this in writing, so as my client knows, I'm always like, I need this in writing, and we haven't seen any written confirmation of that, so at the moment it's still an open question. Obviously, for those who haven't been pardoned, I totally agree, it's not fair, it's not comprehensible for 2 of the journalists to be pardoned and not the other 8. There were another 4 foreign journalists, another 4 Egyptian journalists who were part of the same case, subjected to the same sham process, and therefore they should also have a pardon. And so long as they're not pardoned, they are facing real risks when they cross any border, because some countries have extradition arrangements with Egypt and other countries would send someone to Egypt following a request. You saw that another Al Jazeera person was somewhat briefly detained in Germany. So it can happen, and it obviously hampers not only their personal life, but their ability to do their jobs. And I think for Sue, she wasn't able to continue her work at Al Jazeera.
I was in Germany when our colleague was
Okay.
and
Give them.
called by our people and told you might be a fugitive, so it is actually
Yeah.
pressing for us.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's
No.
it's
I mean, I think in
Dominic,
that
there's a
case-
chair in the front if you'd like to join us. Yeah. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it's okay.
Because I ran into Peter Gresta in New York, and he was seeing the Australian foreign minister. Sue Turton was there. I don't know, Dominic was there too. Yes, I saw that on Twitter. So the battle still. We celebrated your at least personal freedom and Baher's personal freedom, but it's not complete. You still have the hashtag journalism is not a crime hanging over some of you.
Yes, very, very true. And this case had so many first times. You know, it was the first time for somebody to renounce his Egyptian citizenship. It was the first time for the deportation of Peter while he's still being tried. There's a first time where you're pardoned, and we're the only journalists I think on the list. The rest were activists. So, if there's a legal impediment in relation to the absentia, those sentenced in absentia, I do believe there's a chance that this legal impediment could be resolved or tweaked, let's say.
Because there's a suggestion that there's going to be another change in the law. Is that correct? If either of you want to, that the president could make another change in the law. He introduced the law to deport foreigners.
Exactly. It was his initiative to bring in this law last November that allows foreigners to be deported when they're either on trial or serving a sentence. And I mean, he's actually had distanced himself from the case from the beginning, and so it was his initiative to bring about this avenue for release, which was how Peter got out. And obviously, he's the one who pardoned Baher and Mohammed. So, anything can still happen. And we hope that there will be further moves in that direction for the benefit of the others.
Mm-hmm. And Amal, at the time in Cairo, you had said you would argue on two fronts. One was either deportation, which is how Peter Greste got out into Australia, or a pardon. But you argued at the time that a pardon was better. Than you actually mentioned that Eid could be, it's a traditional time to pardon prisoners in Egypt, and so it was 100 others, including Baher. And did that surprise you that it happened in that way, or you were given?
I mean, we thought that it was a definite opening. We'd also heard some positive indications before we got the definitive news, but our approach has been, we've heard some positive things before, we've got to just continue. So on the day of President Sisi's speech at the UN, I was actually scheduled to do an event with Peter in New York, and we were just proceeding on the basis that, don't count your chickens. And then we did get the good news. I think there's two things that are important about the timing. One, it was during Eid, so it was a sort of act of reconciliation in a way, and a sort of compassionate act. It was also one day before the president was meant to be flying to New York to give his speech at the General Assembly. So I think for those of us who've been trying to work out what is the impact of international pressure, I think you can read into that to say that's not a coincidence either. And I think we have to also thank the Canadian government and the governments who have raised this, the US State Department and others, who've raised with President Sisi when they see him and with their counterparts this case every time they meet with him, which meant that he didn't necessarily want his UN visit to be overshadowed by this case. So I think it was Eid. I think it was also the GA.
So I wonder whether there are lessons in this particular case. Every case is different because every country is different. Every country's rules are different. But Mohammed, you have a case of having two passports. Well, now you only have one. But someone with a Canadian passport. And there was constant discussion and criticism throughout those 2 years that whether or not the Canadian government was doing enough. There was a sense in which the Australian government was doing more to help Peter. Just how important is it for a government to stand up and speak out loudly and to work both in public and behind the scenes in a case like yours?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I believe, and I will be starting a debate when I go back to Canada, and I will be speaking in Ottawa on how to improve foreign policy and protection of Canadian citizens, because I do believe that although the consular team and the ambassadors on the ground were doing a great job, throughout the ordeal, even from the beginning, they're visiting me, but there was critique from my family and many people across the world, and I didn't want to believe it when I was in my cell that the government wasn't doing their best. And when I was released on bail, I realized that this critique comes from, there's a reason for it. And I do believe that the Canadian government could have done more. They could have had a more aggressive approach. The Australian Prime Minister, for example, Mr. Tony Abbott, had called Sisi 3 times on the phone to ask for Peter's release. Then he called him to thank him, as far as I understand. And then my family started the Harper Call Egypt, and my friends back in Canada. It's a campaign that was quite successful. And I think the government responded.
Did Harper ever call Egypt?
We don't even know.
That was the hashtag Harper Called Egypt.
I'm not even sure.
Not used now.
Yes, yes.
Did he ever call? Do you know?
I don't think he did, but
well, we knew that there were communications.
Yes,
we don't necessarily know the mode. I think I would agree with that. The ambassador on the ground really used exceptional efforts to support the case and made the case a total priority, far beyond what you would normally see in a consular assistance case.
But that's consular assistance.
Yeah,
That's
there's a
I'm
very
sure the
important
family.
point.
That's not the same
No,
as
but
high
at the
level
highest level,
pressure.
exactly. So when you had Foreign Minister Baird, initially he was like, well, you can't have bullhorn diplomacy all the time. So then we said, but then the question was, well, is it quiet diplomacy or are they just quiet? You know, is there nothing really going on? And so we did expect, I mean, obviously then you wouldn't expect the Prime Minister to say, here is what I said to President Sisi on the phone, but you might have expected more confirmations of phone calls having taken place. I think particularly when there was a moment in the case where the Canadians had actually been told that Mohamed was going to be deported and Peter was sent back to Australia, and then they just didn't do it. And I think at that stage, as a sovereign state, this is the most infamous case of your citizen abroad being subjected to an unfair process, and you basically had an oral treaty with another state. When they renege on that, you know, I think that's when you thought maybe more could have been done.
That was an amazing moment to see Peter deported, and actually it happened in Marwa. I was in the hospital, and Marwa was sitting right there beside me, and we were so excited. But again, you know, you get these mixed emotions, and why am I not on that plane? You know, and you know, you get assurances from your government that you're going. Marwa quit her job. We were ready to go. We were even looking into flights, you know, and then suddenly they threw me back in the cage again in the retrial. So it was intense. And here's something that I believe every government now should take in consideration, that I believe as soon as someone is arrested, the government should intervene from day one, from the most senior level of officials, because any chances of extracting a suspect or a prisoner are best before it's referred to trial, because once it goes into the trial phase and it's into that clogged judicial system, it's really hard for the president to extract you or pull lines for you, you know. And
he even said, President Sisi said, I wish they hadn't gone to court. I wish they had dealt with it.
Been deported.
So he probably would agree with you.
Yeah, and also not only about extracting you, the support that you have all given us, and you know, intervention from highest officials could actually save you on that single day in a prison. If you're sleeping on the floor, they'll get you a bed, they'll get you extra food, they allow you more outings. You could be transferred to another prison. I had a medical issue, for example, and it took a while for them to get on and get me out of that situation, but it was kind of late. But it only happened because of what you guys were doing, and I do believe that the governments should be much faster in intervening immediately as it happens, and not wait for junior ministers or embassy consular staff to come in. It's very, very important, and this is just a little bit of what I want to talk about in Ottawa. Yeah.
But your case is interesting too, because you were both Egyptian and Canadian, and there was this question, and I understand that it did play on the minds of Egyptian officials. Okay, Peter was let, but if they let you go immediately, that would mean that Bahir Mohamed was in prison essentially because he's Egyptian. And we discussed this a lot here at the Frontline Club about how people, local journalists, are much more vulnerable than foreign journalists with a passport, with a government who may or may not pick up the phone. But in your case, you both suffered but benefited from having, at the time, 2 passports. But tell us a little bit about when you had to relinquish your passport, because I remember many of you may have seen when Mohamed came in, after you put a social media campaign saying, what is the price of freedom, should I really give up my nationality for freedom, and then walked in with your Egyptian flag.
Yeah, in court.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think being Egyptian is not a crime.
Yes, exactly,
journalism.
exactly.
yeah, I remember that.
But what was your thinking through that process about, because you felt both the pride about being Canadian and the value that how that could work in your favor, but also your pride at being Egyptian.
Of course. You know, from day one, having the privilege of coming from both sides of the world, that helped me a lot in my reporting, and in general, it's just living with the values you get from both sides. And and then I was asked by the Egyptian government to just drop the citizenship, and we want to help you to get out, and you and Peter are going to leave. And suddenly they changed their mind. I still don't have any answers why I wasn't sent out. So in court, I know the judge already has me framed as this Muslim Brotherhood supporter, a Qatari agent, a spy, you name it. You know, it's just like the courts in Egypt at the moment, the sentiment is really intense, in the sense that they're eradicating anything related to the Muslim Brotherhood. It's almost like what we read about in the 60s with the McCarthyism and just they're burning the books and they just want it all out. And so the judge now is
You felt it
looking-
all through the judiciary because we hear about it in the political.
Oh, of course, yeah. And the judge now sees this guy who dropped his citizenship, so now he thinks he's a traitor. He doesn't care about Egypt, and so I thought, a photo is worth 1,000 words, and maybe he'll get the point if I put the flag up. And to be honest, it did help in the public opinion in Egypt. And this is another thing that we had. I'm very thankful to the Free AJ staff campaign. It was great, and it helped a lot. And I know a lot of people in the newsroom back in Doha were very helpful, but I do believe there had to be a better parallel strategy, and that it should have included much better legal support, Egyptian legal teams on the ground. And although Al Jazeera was advocating outside and lobbying in other places, they weren't doing it in Egypt. And Amal's role and what she brought to the table is that she was explaining to Egyptian ambassadors in Washington, in London, and she started a communication with Egyptian officials inside Egypt to remind them, well, this guy, sort of like protested against the Muslim Brotherhood at one point when I took off the journalism cap and I was able to chat for a bit of a time between CNN and Al Jazeera, that this guy, he's not, a guy who's going to fabricate news. He's never done it in his career. So, and it was very important to just make it clear that there's a distinction between the network and the journalists who work in the network.
And actually, we also filed, along with a colleague of mine from Chambers, we filed an opinion before the Egyptian Supreme Court saying, in addition to all the violations of Egyptian law, here are the violations of international law that have been brought about by this case. And the Court of Cassation ended up issuing actually an opinion that was sort of in favor of the defendant, saying, well, this can't be you can't say that this is a terrorism case because there's not even an allegation of violence or the threat of violence, so you don't have the elements of the crimes, let alone evidence. And that was actually a positive moment. Unfortunately, so then they ordered the retrial. When it went back down to the lower court, we had this second absurd judgment. But we were pursuing both legal and diplomatic strategies at the same time, hoping that one or the other would work. And on the diplomatic side, deportation and pardon. But as you said, we preferred the pardon because others would benefit too. Nationality shouldn't matter when it comes to free speech. And now there's still the final battle for the remaining defendants to also have the injustice that they've suffered recognized.
But having gone this far, do you feel that the last part of the battle is easier?
I saw one positive statement that the Australians had received, because now there's been a formal request made on behalf of the other journalists to get a pardon, and but again, as I said before, with other positive indicators, you don't really know what to make of them. You wait for the result, and you still might not get it in writing.
Yeah, I'm still waiting.
But I hope so. It would make sense. I think what President Sisi has done was a really important first step, but we're not quite there yet.
And if Bahir Mohamed was sitting here with us, Mohamed, what would he say when he was in the prison cell with you and there was that Peter had gone home because he was Australian, you were possibly going to go home because you were Canadian, and there was discussion among some governments about possibly giving Bahir another passport. Did he despair to say, I'll be the one who'll be languishing here? Did he fear that, because the fear was that once all the so-called foreigners were gone, that Bahir would just languish in prison? What did he kind of, without obviously disclosing things which are private, but just so we get a sense about what the feeling was, two different people thrown together but with very different circumstances?
Oh, Bahir is a strong guy. He's an idealistic guy. He wants to have 6 children, and he wants to save the world, and he has this sort of, acceptance to the whole situation, and that's why I really like him, and he's going to be a friend for life. And he was happy to see Peter go, and he would be very happy to see me go, But again, it's terribly tough to just leave anyone behind. And again, I am a changed man, and I'm inspired by what happened to me, and that's why I'm fighting for other journalists right now as we speak. And I don't think any journalist should be thrown in prison. And as you have seen, I've highlighted many of Al Jazeera's shortcomings and mistakes that contributed to our situation. And
Is there anything more? We know that halfway through your battle against to get your freedom became a battle against Al Jazeera, and you chose actually, while you were still in prison, or were you out on bail at that point, to launch a $100 million lawsuit against your employers, who at the time were still paying your salary, were paying for lawyers, although you ended up changing lawyers. I know it's going to be a legal battle, so you may not want to tell everything about it, but we've already discussed how sometimes the passport you have can make a difference to your case, but so too who you work for can have a difference to your case. And in your case, it was a highly politicized trial.
Well, you know, and about my employer.
Still your employer, correct? You're still Al Jazeera journalist?
Ask them.
Dominic, are you guys still colleagues?
We're colleagues forever. He knows that. But yeah, you know, Al Jazeera from day one, the team, we did some really good work, and I was very hypercritical of our own work, everything we've done, because I know the Arabic channels were under the microscope, and I wasn't told in the job interview, but later on I found out a lot of things that infuriated me. And for example, the Al Jazeera Mubashir had been shut down by a court
Which
order.
is the local. Do people know that there's 3 Al Jazeera channels in
Yeah.
Egypt? Mubashir, which is Egypt-based,
Yeah.
and then of course Al Jazeera Arabic, and then Al Jazeera English, which you were working for.
Yes, from day one, I believed that Al Jazeera English was a very respectable organization. Many of the journalists were friends of mine, but I differentiated between Al Jazeera, Mubashir, the Arabic Egypt arm, and apparently, and I distanced myself completely, and it was a condition upon taking the job that we would to do our own news gathering, sourcing, booking. And then I found out that the channel, later on I found out, much later after the arrest, that it was shut down because the Egyptian government decided that it's biased to the Muslim Brotherhood and a threat to national security. Whether you're Al Jazeera or Qatar and you don't want to believe this, that's your business. But you know, where the government, where you're working, is telling you that. So I was very careful in separating between the two. Several issues happened that shouldn't have happened. The network was taking our English reports and dubbing them into Arabic and rebroadcasting it on an officially banned channel. So that was a big problem that put us on the radar. And the national security officer told the judge in court, the witness, that Fahmy works for the Arabic channel. That complicated issues. And then comes the issue of the license. And we're not talking about press passes. I mean, press passes are like driver's license. If you don't have them, you can be punished some way or another. But this is a broadcast license. And apparently, days before I was appointed as bureau chief, that was revoked. The license was revoked, and unfortunately, we found out in court by the prosecutor. And I had specifically asked many times, "Are we legal in the Marriott? What are we doing here?" I mean, we've all worked in hotels covering stories, but it would be for a window of a couple of days, just cover a protest or an angle from a specific balcony or something. But they said, yes, stick to the editorial side, don't worry about it. And we constantly asked as we went, and you know, the answer I found out in court. So that infuriated me.
But we should be clear that
Yeah.
the charge about licensing was so narrow. I mean, the prosecutor talked about, well, press passes and so on. The indictment actually said that the charge was 3 specific pieces of broadcast equipment. One was a satellite phone, one is a video camera. I mean, it's these types of things. 3 named pieces of equipment were the charge about that they didn't have a license for that. So
This was in the August charge. They were talking about broadcasting without a license.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. The rest was terrorism and fabricating false news.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even if there were 3 licenses lacking for 3 bits of equipment, you obviously wouldn't expect to, for it to be a criminal case.
Yeah, so that's what I've been very clear about with the judge. That yes, I didn't forget who put me behind bars, but my strategy in the retrial was to separate between the responsibilities of the network and the journalist, and to make it very clear that this is their responsibility. And I've asked Al Jazeera to take responsibility and present a letter to the judge saying that they have nothing to do with this. This is our fault, but they did not come through. So. And then there was another issue that really angered me. The Al Jazeera lawyer that was defending Bahar and Peter quit in court in front of everybody and told the judge that, you know, I'm withdrawing, I don't want to be part of this case because Al Jazeera sued Egypt while we're in the case and and one of the reasons was that Egypt canceled the broadcast license. I wrote to Al Jazeera from prison and told them, this shouldn't be happening right now. You want to sue Egypt, that's your business, but not while I'm in the cage. You know, and their own lawyer told them that. But they disregarded that, and that is unacceptable to me. And it aggravated the situation. I consider this negligence. They may say that was their way of pressure, but when your lawyer and your bureau chief tells you not to do it and you go ahead, I don't like that. And I do believe that the network presented negligence and misrepresentations, and that they contributed and gave our captors more ammunition, basically. So, we will visit this in court. And I do want to thank very much so Media Defense Legal Initiative here in London, Mr. Peter Norlander, and CPJ, Mr. Joel Simon, for intervening and convincing Al Jazeera to reimburse me for some of the legal fees I have paid. And it was also tough for me to have to see my parents dishing out money to pay for my legal fees, and that's where it is right now.
Well, what an extraordinary turn of events, because actually the last time you and Marwa and I had dinner in Cairo in the Marriott, you were discussing which network to work for. And at the time, you were considering Al Jazeera and weren't sure whether you really wanted to join Al Jazeera. And as it turned out, you had been with them just a few months. And poor Peter Gresta had just been called in for Christmas cover, had never been there before. And then you all get swept up into this.
I think that the Dutch colleague had the most dangerous cup of tea in history. She wasn't even working for them. She was working for a Dutch newspaper, and she went to have tea at the Marriott, and that was the entire
in the cell.
basis of, So she was asking about the Sinai or something completely unrelated.
She was just, discussing Sinai with me in the room.
The officials actually facilitated her departure because they said, look, really, there's no evidence, and that was officials of the state. So.
But, and also, even more astonishing was the first part of the trial, which led to the conviction in June of 2014 for up to 7 years, and Bahir would get 10 years because he had an empty bullet casing that he had picked up on the way. But I know both of you have looked at what the Court of Cassation later threw it out, but the extraordinary so-called evidence that was brought in to convict you as supporting terrorism. I mean, remind us some of the things that were brought into court. In terms of the story,
music
family,
videos of horses galloping.
Other than that embarrassing, very funny moment,
documentary on Gaddafi's
they had
palaces.
They had a photo of me and Mohammed al-Zawahiri, and I was the brother of the leader of Al-Qaeda, and me and Morsi, the former president, in the palace, and I was explaining to the judge and telling him this is called an exclusive, and I'm very proud of what I've done there, and so. I don't know why you're putting this on. And then if you're showing some of the photos I had with some of the Muslim Brotherhood leaders who were ruling the country, where are the photos I have with the military and the others? Why aren't these brought on?
But I mean, most of it was stuff that was broadcast on other channels at a time that predated the indictment, and it included literally like Peter Greste's holiday snaps.
Yeah,
and things.
It was funny.
And if you, for those who haven't seen it, you have to watch the footage of the arrest where they video the seizing of the terrorist equipment, which is like a Mac laptop with Final Cut Pro and pens, but they play against, in the background they play music from the film Thor, and so it sounds really sinister, and they broadcast it on TV, and that was, then ad nauseum, the judgment, so in court, first of all, for hours they were playing this so-called evidence, and then in the judgment there's pages and pages listing what the evidence was. With
that photograph of you and Peter sitting there, I've never seen you looking so glum. I mean, what was going through your mind at that time, December, just around Christmas?
I opened the door and there was a video camera rolling and a guy snapping away, and I was like, "What are you guys producing? A segment?" And it was intense. It was intense. It was very, very tough, and we didn't believe that it would go that far, but. I felt that these guys were really out there to get us, and it was before we even reached the police station, it was reported on TV that we were terrorists, and it was very, very tough, and me and Peter were thrown in a cell with 16 other people, and we didn't have space to lie down on the floor, and, again, the sort of brotherhood we had is what kept us going. And
not Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah. Very sensitive.
Another conviction is coming. Oh no! Well, let's before we go up to the floor, let's not look back. Let's look forward. You're in London for a few days with Marwa, and you're going to head to Canada, and you're going to be going to the University of British Columbia. So what are your plans now?
Well, we're just I've been meeting some people here. I have so many thank yous. I've met with Amnesty family of ours, and you know, it's just great to just see people that were fighting for you, and you see them in person. It's really interesting. And Canada, of course, Marwa's never seen it. I've spoken about it so much, and we're going to introduce Marwa to Canada, and she's going to live there with me. But I'm very interested, and I formed a foundation in an NGO in Vancouver to fight for journalists behind bars, to build on the sort of experience that me and Marwa and have gained throughout this ordeal, and I wanted to support them financially as well. And last night, me, Peter, and Beher received the international award from the Press Club Association, as International Association of Press Club. It was in Warsaw, and Peter was there to receive the award on our behalf, for the three of us, and they awarded us with 3,000 euros. So I will forward this money to the Treasury in my foundation, and it will be allocated to supporting the many cases that we are working on right now. And these cases are very important for me. I know there's about 220 journalists behind bars across the globe, and but these people, I have been dealing with their families, talking to their lawyers, and I've been advocating for them. Shaukan, he's Mahmoud Shaukan, he's an Egyptian photographer that's been in prison for 2 years. And
so relatively little attention given
oh
to
yeah,
this.
yeah, that's
he's
why.
He's been writing, put them on the people letters out of prison. He's very ill.
Very ill.
He's terrified he's going to just die in prison.
Yeah. He's very ill. His family's worried. He's going to spend his 3rd birthday next week in prison, and his court is on December 13 or 15. I don't recall as much right now, but again, we need to put solidarity behind him. Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia, his wife has been all over the world fighting for him. He's been 10 years and 1,000 lashes for expressing his ideas, not even about Islam. It was about, the clerics, and, and Jason Rezayan, and Amal has also been following on the case very closely. I spoke to his brother just yesterday. Friday is his 440 days behind bars in another bogus case of him being involved with espionage
in Iran,
and Washington Post reporter, and he's, his lawyer has stated very clearly to our foundation that the trials are being held in secret, and they can't even she can't even speak to the media about what's happening inside the courtroom, which is unbelievable. We had the luxury of at least, getting our story and our plight was being covered. We have Atina, she's also a cartoonist that's serving 12 years for a cartoon satire in Iran, and Mohamed Al-Ajami, he's a Qatari poet, and he's serving 15 years for one verse in a poem about the revolution in the Arab Spring. Wubshit Tayi, Ethiopian journalist who's in Ethiopia, he's been in prison for 3 years and more now, and he was imprisoned with the Kaliti Foundation of Sweden. There are 2 guys, Martin and Johan, from the Kaliti Foundation in Sweden. They were imprisoned with him. Again, they donated to my legal fees, so I thank them, but they're supporting him. And finally, and this is very important, Mohamed Rasool. Mohamed Rasool is a fixer and a young journalist who was detained with the Vice crew in Turkey just a couple of weeks ago. And I read about his case while I was in prison in the newspaper. And as soon as I read the first 2 lines, I knew there's something wrong. Terrorism, again, journalists being caught in the terrorism, accusations. But the issue of Mohamed Rasool could use immediate intervention because he's been in prison for 40 days. His case has not been referred to court yet. And intervention right now could make a huge difference for him. And he's originally Iraqi, and again, he was caught with 2 Western journalists. They were released. He's still in there, and I really hope that we can all support him and do something to keep the awareness about his case alive, because he could be referred to court any day, and you know what happens.
I totally agree, and it's actually on the legal side, you see some trends across these cases where they're the same types of laws that are being used or abused through the judiciary. So you get
new laws now too.
New laws.
Yes.
So, for instance, the one that was used in the Egyptian case, broadcasting false news. Qatar has just passed a similar law. Kuwait has a similar law. China's done something similar. So they're really broad, and they allow you move to capture, if you are a prosecutor who seeks to do so and a judge who wants to convict on that basis, free speech. And then really broad definitions of terrorism or espionage, like the Jason Rezaian case in Iran. And then, like the Saudi blogger case, you see it's blasphemy, so insulting Islam. And I've read some of the language that was cited in his judgment, and it's not something that should be the basis of a criminal conviction under any kind of international standard. So. But these cases are extraordinarily difficult because the ones that you've mentioned, for instance, is not like if it happens in Azerbaijan, you can go to Strasbourg to the European Court of Human Rights. This is happening in countries where you don't really have recourse to a judicial mechanism. If your own country's courts fail you, you rely a lot on these kinds of international campaigns, and there's a legal component, there's also a diplomatic component, and the media is incredibly important. So. I fully endorse what you're doing, and I think everybody has a role to play.
But but in terms of the trend, Amal, often here at the Frontline Club, we look at cases of journalists facing dangers from covering conflict. We've talked a lot of late about the threat of kidnapping from extremist groups like the so-called Islamic State. But now here tonight, and let us remind ourselves, it's a moment for celebration. But it's also worrying that it's the law that is being used against journalists. And if you're correct, it's the law is actually going, in many countries, going against press freedom and the safety of journalists just doing their job.
Reporters Without Borders said that it's all going downhill across all the continents. And if you look at the number of journalists killed or imprisoned, and then there's the more subtle things, like you were saying, they might not go after foreign journalists in the same way, but the next New York Times correspondent in Egypt came from Pakistan. He had to leave. They literally came to his house and said, "You're out." And that's good treatment in Pakistan if you're a journalist. If you're a local journalist and you're not in a big city, then there's obviously much worse consequences. So, and then there's self-censorship where people are working in countries where they know that they are subject to this kind of intimidation. They will then censor what they say. And even in Egypt, again, 13 newspaper editors issued this statement saying, "Okay, we will not report in a manner that undermines the state," or how do you hold the government to account?
But when Mohamed first asked you to take on the case, because he wanted his own lawyer to represent him internationally, when you looked at the case, if you want to share with us, did you look at it and think, this is going to be really tough? I know you have to be optimistic in every case, but what did you think? I suppose we want to feel hopeful that other cases as well will eventually be resolved, no matter how hard they look at the outset.
It led me to write an op-ed called The Anatomy of a Show Trial, because I saw every single aspect of sham proceedings that you would be looking for, paying to review defense evidence, and a judge known as the executioner and things like that. So, it made me angry, and I also, because one, I knew he was innocent, but also I realized what was at stake, because Egypt is a leader in the region. Egypt is a country that other Arab and African countries look to, and this was a big moment and a big precedent. So I feel privileged that I've been able to contribute to the case, and that we're here in London
Still
to discuss it together.
Hasn't sinked in yet. Now it's sinking in.
But it is always the case, isn't it, when you talk about these issues, is that there's the big, broad principles that bring us here tonight, which is freedom of the press. And I think that's what everyone was fighting for when they fought for the Al Jazeera journalists. But there's also the stories of individuals. It's always about the individual stories of journalists, their mothers, their fathers, their fiancés, their wives, etc. So before I turn it on, let's get this down to the really, really personal. When you were in prison, aside from missing Marwa, what did you miss most of all in terms of a life of freedom?
Well, you try to survive by escapism. You don't have access to any information or TV or radio, and you just try to focus on keeping your mental side and physical side going. Me and Peter and Bahar started a mock radio show in prison, and we called it Al Jazeera Live, and we were interviewing all the prisoners. A lot of the prisoners, we could only see the faces and their eyes through the door, and we would interview them, and we dealt with it like a TV show. We were actually producing the whole day what we're going to ask them and what not, and us journalists, we almost die on the field, and many of our colleagues have died trying to get close to these people, and then they're all sitting there. You have jihadists coming in from Syria and Libya, and you have the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. So that kept us going for a while, and then yeah, but you know, you have so much time to think about what life really means. You know more than most that us journalists are a very competitive bunch, and we're always trying to get on the front line before anyone else. And we're
You used to compete with us in Egypt.
yeah, we're competitors, but but Lise always has her scarf. You could be in a city and bombs are dropping, and and Lise is reporting the news very eloquently and elegantly, and I listen to it. So it's.
But what is you? Peter talked about learning Arabic and exercising. I mean, what else did you do to keep your spirits alive?
Marwa got me we had a library of books, and I was.
I heard you say Marwa got me a treadmill, and you get this cell taken up by the whole treadmill.
Yeah. We were doing a lot of reading, a lot of political discourse between the three of us. We both come from different political beliefs, so it was fun to always just argue about it all and why it happened and whatnot. And you'd be surprised at your threshold. And in the beginning, you'd think, I can't last here more than a day or two, and this has to be over. But your body physically starts adapting, your mind starts adapting, and I was really, really looking forward to a moment like this. I think I was seriously thinking of going out and being free and be able to speak freely and just put it all in context, and because this case came at a time when ISIS was rising in Ukraine and all the airplanes accidents, and so a lot of the context I believe was not very clear in the media.
I'm going to open it up to the floor, and I just want to say that Dominic, if you'd like to offer something, Marwa, if you would like to offer Marwa. If you would like, because there's always the story of the people outside waiting. You don't have to do it right now, but at some point, if you'd like to offer your thoughts as well about, from the other side of prison walls, what's it like to have nearest and dearest inside. I think we have a microphone here. Yeah. Okay.
Well, if you want me to, I'll just say that this is the first time I've seen my boss for about nearly 2 years, and the last time we saw each other was with Marwa and Mohamed at the Marriott cell. We had dinner and we talked about what plans we would have for stories. We were planning about the elections and that sort of thing. And I don't think any of us thought that what would happen would happen, if you see what it could happen. So seeing you here is obviously personally amazing. Coming here, I was thinking of what I might say to you and what we all thought about what happened. And all the journalists in Doha, because that's where I was for most of the time, couldn't believe what had happened. We all thought it must be a mistake. And then when we saw the evidence, we realized quite how ridiculous it was. And the suggestion somehow that Peter and I were these financial kingpins and you were the mastermind. Well, we know that's complete nonsense. And we were really shocked, and Sue as well. Sue and I obviously got much closer in the last 2 years than ever we had before, and we could not believe what had happened. And we were really, really, how can I put this? There was a sense of desperation when you two went back to prison, because we really thought that how was it possible that the Cassation Court, as Amal says, could throw out the evidence and then you go back. And then the idea that you're pardoned and yet the rest of us, and we have to say here that there are 4 Egyptian colleagues who are still...
Mohamed Fawzi.
Yeah, Mohamed Fawzi is Ala Bayoumi,
Anas. Anas, and Rena, who's not...
They have no government speaking for them, the 4 Egyptians. And Mohamed Fawzi was at the UN General Assembly with me, Peter, and Sue last week, making the appeal as far as possible. We spoke to the Committee to Protect Journalists who received us, and that was most welcome. And they all spoke about your fortitude, the fact that you were able to be so eloquent, notwithstanding the ordeal you've been through. And that's something that I'm sure that Sue and everyone else at Al Jazeera would say about you, that you still seem to be the same person I used to have arguments with about what stories we should do. So on a personal thing, it's great to see you, and as you say, we will go and have beers, which of course shows that you can't be a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes, best evidence. Just make sure you take a photo, please.
Yeah, indeed.
Tweet it.
Yes.
And anyway, but of course this is your night. It's not for me to be talking, so I'm sure we all want to hear from Mara as well. But it's great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you.
you hadn't gone home for Christmas, it would have been you. It's a big what if.
I'd actually told Al Jazeera that I was prepared to go back on the 29th of December, which is the day they were arrested.
It's true.
And I have a text message that Mohamed and I sort of, on the day that I flew out of Egypt, he texted back to me, he said, I'm looking forward to seeing you if I'm still a free man. If not, I'll be in Torah.
Are you serious?
As a joke?
As a joke, yeah.
And this is what, well, yeah.
The rest is history.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm with the International Center for Journalists. We were one of the nonprofits that was affected, a couple of years ago. Same problem with licenses, and our Egyptian staffers had to leave the country, and now are in Washington, D.C. But my question goes to the voiceless. What you talked about hope. You were somehow lucky, we can say, but what about the journalists that don't have a powerful employer, or any financial aid, or they're freelancers, all the cartoonists? Where do they find hope? Do they have to put all of their focus on finding good legal advice, or is it going to the government the first step that they should take? We're not CPJ, but we are approached by journalists from around the world who have issues. What is if they had to do one thing quickly? What will be the main component of this for them to find help, support?
Oh no, you're fine.
You want to go for this?
I
forgot.
You only need one microphone. One microphone is enough, Mohamed.
I've been in prison for too long. No, I think there are many lawyers out there that are willing to work pro bono, and Amal has provided pro bono support for me, except for some just bit of expenses for the agency. But the point is that, again, there are so many people out there that are willing to just put free press campaigners who don't do it for anything but the actual hope to help. And there are so many organizations that are doing so. But I do believe that there has to be a very powerful parallel strategy. The Free AJ Staff campaign was great, but there had to be very powerful lawyers present, because it's not only solved inside the court. There is lobbying behind the scenes. There is so much work that's done outside, engaging with the media to clarify what is exactly some of the context that's lost. And again, the social media part was so important in this case.
I changed my profile photo to defend it.
Really?
Social media.
Yeah, social media
People
was so
often wonder
important.
whether Twitter and Facebook just makes all of us feel good rather than actually doing it.
No, it does make a
us feel good,
difference.
but it does make a...
Yeah. And I
you
want
had people in the authorities looking at your Twitter account.
Oh yeah, they're translating it into the local press. I mean, if I tweet it now, it would be translated into the headlines into Egyptian press, and everything you were saying was outside in the Egyptian press, and it does make a huge difference. Social media. I will be talking more extensively in the near future about that, and so I think this collective effort is why I'm here today, and yeah.
And I have to say, since I think we're allowed to say it now, that actually Mohamed and I were keeping in touch with each other when he was in jail through direct messaging on Twitter. When I was I was in Gaza, and he goes, "Lise, I wish I was there." I said, "Mohamed, where are you?"
Well, since you put the secret out in the open, I think me and Amal. I think I'm probably your first client we were communicating. We weren't using pigeons or messages in a bottle, but we were actually communicating through a phone that I had, and it was
a highly sophisticated communication network known as WhatsApp.
WhatsApp, exactly, and
very extensively and daily, but it helps.
In the litigation process and in the campaign, and yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I know the.
Yes. I'm going to take two here. There's two women right here, one after the other.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Esther Dormaj from BBC, but also previously from Al Jazeera, and this question is for Mohamed. So you've been very critical of Al Jazeera, but also the organization has its reputation for a lot of risk-taking and also shedding a light on the Middle East and regions where, let's say, other broadcast networks wouldn't previously go. This goes as far back to Emin Mohieldin and Shireen Tadros when they were the only, let's say, Western journalists in Gaza. You've also talked about the media environment now, which is, I think, compromised for everybody. It's not really safe anymore. So considering that, how would you say that Al Jazeera might be able to regain some of its sheen that a lot of people have said it's lost since 2012, since Tahrir? And then a fun question for you. You're going back to Canada. Hockey season has started. Which team are you supporting?
No, I bought my tickets already. I'm serious. I'm going to, I am going to a hockey game, and they're hearing me now. It's, I'm very excited about it. October 27th, I'll be there. The Habs, the Montreal. I'm there.
They don't do very well, but it's good to support.
To answer your question, in my critique of Al Jazeera in Egypt, and I was very clear that the network had a start in 1996 that changed in a positive way the media, the landscape of the media, and many people were very happy and excited to work for Al Jazeera. And again, I believe that taking risks, we all take risks as journalists. We get shot at, we get tear gassed, we work all day, then we got to go work in our sleep, so it doesn't end. But in the case of Egypt, it was just more than the risks you take on the ground. There was, I believe the network should have provided a better security umbrella for us on the ground. They should have had a better security assessment. And I've offered them, when I took the job, that to let me speak to the authorities to better explain the difference between the English and the Arabic and find out more about the licenses and whatnot. And I was told everything was fine. But back to your point of what it can do, again, to improve that, there's so many aspects of this case that needs to be used as a case study. And I believe that's another, time. It's such a wide range of suggestions, and we'll definitely be expanding on this issue.
Hi, my name is Rani, and I'm from Canada. I'm very excited about your pardon too. Just to point out, Marwa, you're in for a treat because you're going back to Canada in time for Canadian Thanksgiving.
Oh, yes.
So you have turkey and pie to look forward to. Mohamed, back to you. Your return to Canada is actually at a very unique time given our federal elections are going on, and given the response that you received from the Conservative government at times was bumpy, to put it mildly. And Amal, you've also been very vocal in sort of your opinion about how the government was reacting. So Mohamed, I want to know, in terms of through your NGO, through your voice that you have a very powerful voice, what are your plans exactly in terms of facing the federal elections and giving a voice to all the journalists around the world that don't have the freedom that you do at this moment?
Well, I have to thank the Liberal Party in Canada and the NDP. I'm planning to meet the lead, Mr. Thomas Mulcair and Mr. Justin Trudeau and Mr. Paul Dewar, because they engaged directly with my wife and family, and they were speaking to my lawyers, and Ms. Amal was speaking to Mr. Justin Trudeau, and they questioned the Prime Minister many times in Parliament about the mild stance and about leaving me without a passport for 2 months when I had no Egyptian passport. I was, pretty much with no documents for 2 months, and that was very, very disturbing, considering that, in Egypt you need a passport not just for traveling, you need it for providing your identity in the many checkpoints that are dotted all over the country, and renting a flat, renting a car, and I couldn't do any of that. So get married. Oh, that was another story. Yeah. It almost took over the story of the terrorism issue, but
alleged.
Yeah, alleged.
Alleged marriage?
Alleged marriage. So yes, I will be. I'm not endorsing any party, but I will be at the rallies. I plan to speak. I've been, invited to speak at several universities and with NGOs and people that stood beside me, like the CJFE, were fighting from day one, the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, and CAJ. And also, I do believe that I will continue to fight and sort of use the spotlight that, shouldn't last long. But I do want to fight for a lot of these people that I mentioned and others, and build on the expertise that we've all gained through this ordeal. And that's my next phase.
Because I think I should say, for people who don't follow Canadian media, I'm Canadian as well, is that in terms of what works in terms of getting people their freedom in Canada, the Canadian media covered this trial. It, every twist and turn of it. All of the Canadian press foundations took it up as a cause. So it wasn't just the politician, it was right across the society. And I hope it does leave a lasting legacy in understanding the importance of a free press to a democratic society.
Yeah, very much so, yeah.
Yes, microphone.
I just wanted to ask,
Introduce.
given
Yes. Your name, you introduce.
Oh, my name is Amir Matar.
Yeah.
I helped with the case a little bit.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, with regards to the Egyptian media, there's been a paradigm shift since 2011, 2012 in blind support for government and for federal policies. And I was wondering, did you find any actual support from independent media outside of the state media in Egypt throughout the case at all? Or was it all just international campaigning?
Well, if you have Amal Clooney on the show, then there's definitely been a revolution in the Egyptian media. That's to summarize my response, because a lot of the media there from day one, they decided that we were terrorists, that we were guilty, and then there was a sort of a shift, and there was a responsive. They started responding in a better way, and realizing that these guys may not actually be terrorists. But I do believe that the media in Egypt some of the media has also supported our case towards the end, and but I do hope that more Egyptian media realizes that this the free expression and freedom of the press is what we need in Egypt more than anything right now, and especially because the government there should have a watchdog, checking what they're doing. And a lot of the things that bother me about the Egyptian media is that they don't actually consider what is happening to you as a journalist, and there's many journalists who are being caught in prison not because of their journalism. For example, there's a bit of a confusion about the number of journalists behind bars in Egypt. And I wanted to talk about that, but it just slipped my mind. That CPJ says they're 18, others say they're 60 or 70, and in prison I noticed why this confusion was happening. Some journalists were arrested on the field and while they were doing their job, and some journalists were arrested and under the pretext that they were Muslim Brotherhood or sympathizers with the Muslim Brotherhood, but they happen to be journalists. So this is why there's a confusion with the number of journalists that are behind bars and whatnot.
And I think the best way of looking at it is who is being imprisoned or proceeded against in some manner because of speech that's critical of the authorities, and that actually is a better way of looking at it than just journalists, because you've had people tweet in 140 characters, a criticism of a court judgment, and then they go after them. Or, I earlier this week spoke about another case that I'm involved in, representing the former president of the Maldives, and said there are grounds legally for sanctions against the country. And I'm told by colleagues on the ground that, well, now the head of the government's party has called for you to be arrested, and you've been declared an enemy of the state, and that there should be a criminal prosecution brought against you. So it can be lawyers, it can be NGOs, it can be, and what ties it all together is, are you allowed to discuss and debate what the government is doing? And that should be the real sort of determining factor, and that's what we're all fighting for.
I'll be there for you.
Thank you. Can I get Marwa as well, because she was a good advocate.
Yeah, Marwa's lethal. She's lethal. I mean, the Egyptian authorities and the prosecution and the court, they see her, everybody hides. I'm telling you.
Here.
Thank you. Tom Walters, CTV. You've spoken about your desire when you return to Canada to initiate a discussion about what the Canadian government should be doing to protect Canadians abroad. Where does that discussion begin? I mean, we know some of the shortcomings in the handling of your case. What are the steps that are needed to be taken? What's the remedial action? What's the call to action? What should Canadians expect and demand of their government? And what day do you go back?
Well, for example, when you get sentenced to 7 years and your government says we're very disappointed, while other governments who don't have defendants in the case are going out and saying it's a draconian sentence, that's a start. And then we go on about what I mentioned before, that intervention needs to come immediately from the highest levels and of the government, and to make sure that you're speaking to the president immediately before it goes out of control. There's also the way, you have a government making a law that could help you, and then your foreign minister refuses to speak to your lawyer at a time, you have one of the best lawyers in the world giving you free advice on how to use this new law to extract your citizen, and you act like it's not even there. That's a start.
What's your plan for going back? Do you have one yet? A return date to Canada?
I don't have a return date yet, but it's very soon. And I will be lecturing in University of British Columbia. I'm very excited about that. I want to share my experience with the students there, and especially the journalism students. And again, I'll be speaking around the country. But I'm very excited about going to Ottawa and really, really discussing this debate and these suggestions in a more thorough manner. That's for sure.
I'm going to take a few questions because there's quite a few hands up, and it's quite good to get a sense of what people are thinking. If you want to bring a microphone over here, this woman here, and what were the hands again? Show me the hands. And the woman with the nice black hat. So your question and then your question. There was some other, it's like an auction, you're trying to.
I'm also from Canada.
Oh, this is turning into a little
I graduated.
tribal event here. Could all the non-Canadians leave the room, please?
And I graduated from UBC a year and a half ago from the School of Journalism. So
Excellent.
I'm excited that you're going there.
Excellent.
Like I said, I'm Canadian. I'm also Russian.
Oh.
And you talked a bit about having a dual citizenship. And the Canadian, I'm sure you've heard, the Canadian government has a new law that allows them to revoke citizenship from people convicted of terrorism offenses.
Oh.
And you were held on terrorism charges. So I'm wondering, my question to you is, do you think under different circumstances could that law have been used against you? And what do you think Canada might gain from that law, if anything? And what do you think it might lose?
To answer your question,
The students you're going to meet at UBC.
yeah, I was aware of this law C-24 when it was initiated in Canada, and I was worried, and I asked the embassy to bring me the law and so I could read it exactly, and they did, and I read it in prison, and I was very concerned because although the war on terrorism across the globe, needs exceptional approaches, but to use this as an excuse to clamp down on civil liberties and it's a very dangerous law, C-24, because it basically overrides the judiciary, and you have one minister that can decide whether you keep your citizenship or not. And it was very worrying. Then they calmed my anxiety and they told me that it won't apply to you. But again, throughout this ordeal, I learned not to believe anything until I see it happening. So I do believe this law is dangerous. I believe that it should be revisited, and especially that, again, so many people, tomorrow morning, a Canadian citizen could be in a similar situation like mine and could be innocent and finds himself in a terrorism case, be it you're a journalist or a doctor. And so I don't like C-24.
Do you think it creates a misperception about dual citizens?
Well, if it did, you can say now that I'm fully Canadian. But it does give a negative image, and it gives, Canada is well known across the globe that it's a very democratic country, and that's why so many people go to Canada and immigrate there and want to be part of the Canadian system and take on these values. So it does send negative messages across the globe.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. It's a real tragedy because Canada is a country of immigrants, and we have this expression in Canada, which I don't think you use in Britain, called the hyphenated Canadians, where you're Canadian, Bangladeshi, Canadian, Pakistani, Canadian, Egyptian. Everyone has the gift of having more than one, a rich culture behind them.
Okay. Hi, I come from Egypt. I just wanted to ask you, do you really think that things would change in Egypt, specifically in the coming few years, with regards to freedom of speech, especially that lots of Egyptians, like from my friends and the way I see it from like social circles, they support the government and the oppression of speech. And would you be willing to report from Egypt or to report anything related to Egypt in the coming future?
Just hold that. Does anyone else have a question about Egypt? Because I want to give everyone a chance to, just so we'll add to that question. This lady, or you just scratching your nose? Yes. Don't go to an auction. You could get into trouble. Do you like to say something about Egypt? Just before Mohamed, in case it's something similar. Yes. Okay. Do you want to perhaps that?
Hi, I'm Heidi. I'm not a journalist. I'm also of Egyptian background from Australia, actually. I just wanted to find out, and it was similar to the question that gentleman in the blue and white striped shirt asked. Yeah, hi. Really, I mean, I didn't know too much about the public's reaction to your case. It may have been covered, but I might have been ignorant to the fact. So, and also wanted to find out how your family were faced. Were they faced with any scrutiny or? But I didn't know, international outcry, surely.
Yes.
We saw that, but the Egyptian people, I didn't see much coverage of it. Were they, in support of you, or I'm not too sure, so.
Today I subscribe to a website which is monitoring Egyptian media, and after Mohamed is all over Twitter talking about how he left, there was a report saying today, reports are that the Al Jazeera journalist Mohamed Fahmy has allegedly left Egypt now, so they did cover it. Please.
Yes, I do understand. We have so many friends and people in Egypt who are very supportive of what's happening, and again, this is. I don't think that the way freedom of expression is held, the current status is acceptable, and I think there's so much to be done. And I have been in constant contact with the current and former head of the Egyptian Journalism Association, the syndicate, and they are currently working on a new charter. And I've been also contributing to this charter, and it will be presented to the Egyptian president in the next several days, with many suggestions about how you can protect journalists from prosecution, what you could do to improve the registration of journalists, so we're not, caught in this, loopholes of bureaucracy. And so there are efforts, and I know there are efforts, and a lot of people, Egyptians inside, who are trying to improve the situation. Whether or not the government is doing enough, I think that they're getting the message now very clearly that they should visit this file and take it very seriously, because again, it's a sign of a democratic, healthy society if your press is able to report freely. And they're going into this parliamentary elections, and they're hoping to instate a parliament. Not sure how inclusive it will be, but I do believe there's signs of positive developments in Egypt on the economic aspect and the political aspect. However, there's a long way to go, of course.
And the coverage in Egypt of your case?
The coverage in Egypt of our case was close to non-existent in the beginning. Yeah.
More than the coverage, public support.
Was there an outcry among the journalist syndicate?
Syndicate helped.
The syndicate helped. They wrote letters to the president. They tried to intervene, but that also happened, after an army of Western journalists went physically with a letter to the journalism syndicate that was written by our friends in the press, and there was support from the Egyptian journalism syndicate, and they were trying to lobby behind the scenes. However, it was very tough in the beginning because, again, Al Jazeera had become public enemy number one, and the image, Al Jazeera, the brand had become so toxic, and we paid the price and became pawns in this ongoing, score settling between Egypt and Qatar. And, I just hope that my release and Baher and others that were released, political activists, could be a new beginning for spirit of reconciliation. And I hope, that we can just see more positivity there.
Yeah, I mean, not to leave things on too gloomy a note, I think the best sign recently that we've had for press freedom in Egypt is the fact that you're sitting here, and the fact that in this case where the political stakes couldn't have been higher, as you say, there's this ongoing battle between Egypt and Qatar, the president still did intervene to pardon you and to pardon Bahed and to set you free. So I think that's, we do have to just take a moment to really celebrate that and to realize its import. I also mentioned there's been this self-censorship to some extent, and so you had this group of journalists who said, okay, we won't report in this manner, but then you had a backlash to that, and another petition was filed saying, well, we don't agree with that self-censorship. So there are people on the ground in local NGOs and local media who are doing courageous work and who are persisting in difficult circumstances. And hopefully this pardon means that, at the highest levels there might be a shift in the approach. I mean, there's some signs with some of the new laws coming out that are not good. Obviously the parliament is yet to be convened, so we'll have to see. But the fact that you're here is definitely a very, very positive message from the highest levels.
The kind of questions you got from Egyptian journalists as opposed to, say, foreign journalists, did you sense there was a different interest, a different angle on the case, or?
I sensed nervousness. I sensed that they were like, look, I agree with you, but I can't really, be seen with you, kind of thing. So it's obviously easier for me because I don't live there, and that's why even when in my dealings with local council, the arrangement was there are certain things that I can do that perhaps they can't, working within the system.
Yeah.
But, they're the brave ones, they're the ones doing the difficult job. So I have the greatest respect for those who are still taking the risks that they have to take in order to keep doing the work that they're doing.
Maybe they were worried about dealing with a Lebanese-British lawyer. Okay, more questions? Yes, okay.
What's the name of your foundation and how can we support it?
Nothing like your foundation, Amnesty International. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for supporting us. Really, no, really.
Is that what we call in our business a leading question?
Give us a plug. Give yourself a plug.
Oh, okay. Well, it's called the Fahmy Foundation, and I'm very, very excited, and I'm learning as I go what it is how to just, make, a very powerful intervention, and I'm planning to really. It was a soft launch at the beginning, but I'm going back to Canada, and I'm dedicate a lot of my time to that, and I have my lawyers, Gary Caroline and Joanna Giselson in Canada. They're also part of the foundation, and we hope to just really, really put in, powerful work for these specific cases now and more to come.
Good. That's very good to mention it. And it's got a Twitter site, Fahmy Foundation, where you find, to your credit, even when you were in prison, your Fahmy Foundation kept up the Twitter account and mentioning particular cases of journalists and putting family pictures, and it was good. It was good to see. Two battles at once. More questions? Yes. We have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you. It's a question for Amal. I wanted to find out, did you feel it was... Here.
Oh, sorry.
That's Foundation. Did you feel it was a disadvantage to be a woman representing the case in Egypt in dealing with the lawyers, or it didn't make a difference?
Not that I was aware of, no.
Or being an outsider? Because you dealt with the international side, and then the Egyptian lawyers dealt with the...
No, I mean, I think being an outsider was helpful, because as I said, I don't work within the system on a daily basis, so I was able to be perhaps more bold or outspoken than sometimes my client.
She was actually
the two of them kept telling each other, "No, don't say that. No, you don't say that."
She was actually more fierce than the men in this case, and she was, and I were trying to tone each other down. I mean, Emma would.
There was a lot of back and forth.
Yeah, there was a back and forth.
But we got there.
Yeah, and we got there.
No, I mean, I was never made to feel that being a woman was in any way relevant or a disadvantage.
But did you deal with the Egyptian lawyers in Egypt? Or?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yes, good. Okay, two questions here. These two gentlemen. Yes, just behind you. Put your hands up, and then, gentlemen.
Firas Khatib, journalist from the BBC. My question is, I see that you are very optimistic, and I'm happy for that. But
you sound suspicious.
Yeah, it's a hope on the ground. But my question is, why are you optimistic? Because you have 500 satellite channels in the Middle East. why producer or cameraman in Al Jazeera, even in the BBC, is important for the public. And you are raising important point. However, the public, they really don't care, while the governments in the Middle East are turning crazy.
Well,
No.
I'm probably more optimistic because I haven't been on the field for a while. But you know, once I'm back on the field, I'll join your club and I'll be like very, very depressed again about what's happening in the world right now. And you know, I'm following it, and you know, it was very, very tough for me to be in prison and watching these jihadis celebrating Charlie Hebdo or celebrating the death of Stephen Sotloff and James Foley. So. You know, I do feel that we have to remain positive because these people were celebrating what they see as a victory to them, and that our civil liberties are being swept away. The governments are using their war on terror to clamp down on our freedoms. Journalists are being, you know, killed. God bless, you know, all those who have demised. But also, that's why I'm being positive, because I don't want them to win. I don't want these jihadists to win. I don't want this somber mood to take over. But again, check with me when we're back on the field and we can have this discussion again.
Yeah, we need to.
Yeah,
we need
exactly.
to go. Yeah.
That's the way to go.
Hi, I'm Martin Short, a journalist and documentary maker. Tonight, the story is quite properly the journalist, but I'm sure you'll agree that the far, far bigger story is what's going on in Egypt as a whole. We have hundreds and hundreds of people awaiting death, presumably, unless there's some amazing change of policy by the government rather than by the judges. This is a totally politicized judiciary, and public opinion, as far as I can see, has just disappeared. They are just prepared to give Sisi a complete laissez-passer and to do whatever he wants. Have you, as a journalist, noticed, or of course, as you say, you've been in jail for quite a while, but I mean, we have a problem here that nobody is really reporting Egypt properly, partly because of intimidation through cases like yours. But I think that just the whole cause of journalism is really in the doldrums, because this is a massive story, what's going on in Egypt. And no one, least of all any Western government that wants to do deals with Egypt, is prepared to speak out.
Yeah. I think both of us would like to answer this. Yeah. I would just like to say that the situation in Egypt, with this case specifically, our sentence and the case hit two birds with one stone. It was a message to all the journalists in Egypt that, you know, if you're not, you know, sort of towing the government line, you know, this could happen to you. But it was also a message that if you're supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, as Qatar is doing, and it's not a secret, we will get you. And thankfully, the journalists were not intimidated, and they continued to support us when we were in the cage. I was outspoken in the court, and I've mentioned this to the judge many times, that, you know, a lot of what's happening in this court should not be in a criminal court. It should be in a debate. Whether you believe what happened in Egypt was a coup or a revolution, don't bring me to court to discuss that. And yes, there is, you know, the judiciary there. There's, you know, issues that needs to be very clearly highlighted. And you know, it did hurt me a lot to live in a wing with a lot of people who were sentenced to death, and they're waiting for that moment, and they're wearing the red suit. But, you know, so yes, this is a file that needs to be reviewed, and I think the president in Egypt and a lot of people now are looking to review these issues of civil rights and human rights and freedom of the press.
I agree with you that there are these concerning developments. I'm sure my colleague from Amnesty would agree. You've had 10 times the number of death sentences in the past year as in previous years, and you've actually seen the implementation of death sentences. So it's not just that they all get overturned on appeal, although some of them do. You also are seeing these trials with sort of 300-400 people being tried together, where it's obviously impossible to distinguish individual criminal responsibility. So all of those trends are concerning. I think since we don't want to end on a completely gloomy note, I would just say the government is not monolithic and neither is the judiciary. So even in our case, you saw, 2 trial courts issuing absurd judgments, but you had the Court of Cassation issuing a good judgment, and you obviously have elements of the government that sought to bring about justice belatedly, but finally did do in this case. So I think the work that lawyers will have to do and journalists will have to do and human rights activists is to make sure you're pushing those elements of the government that are a force for good, and so that people who were marching as part of the Arab Spring didn't expect that their choice was going to be either a religious state or a police state, that you can get to a stage where you do have civil liberties but you also have security, and hopefully that's a place that we can get to in Egypt. And at least for today, we can take a moment to celebrate what's happened to this journalist.
And just something I wanted to say. This trial, again, I believe it's a case study, and it's been dubbed sometimes, not just the Marriott cell. It's a trial that's probably the most obvious, just analysis of what the media really means. And in this trial, it's very obvious how journalism and politics overlap, and how the media landscape in the Arab region has become almost like a minefield. You're walking in, or even if you're sitting in the newsroom, you don't know what could happen tomorrow morning to you as a journalist. So again, it did spark issues that are related to not just safety and protection, but also objectivity, and what it means to be an objective journalist, and how politics should not be injected in any of your reporting, regardless of your nationality or your political beliefs. I mean, so yes, it's an important case that needs to be well dissected.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we should pick up on Amal's point that we don't want to end tonight on a negative note in a profession which all too often has to report on negative news, and of late there's been a lot of very troubling news. Let us celebrate tonight, and also recognize that all of you here tonight, in ways big and small, have done your part in fighting for press freedom and underlining that journalism is not a crime. So I think we should all feel very proud tonight that we have this occasion tonight to celebrate the freedom of Mohamed Fahmy, and hopefully Dominic and the others will have their cases. Amal, I also want to say to you, because it's not often we have a human rights lawyer here, but the fact that you, in choosing among cases which deal with abuses of power, the relationship between the state and the individual, you took on the case of press freedom and made a difference. And I think we want to recognize all lawyers who do fight for journalists, and we need more human rights lawyers fighting for journalists. Marwa, I know you didn't want to take the stage, but I want to say that you first, a girlfriend to fiancé to wife, who we see also all too often, the mother, the brother, the father, the friend, the wife who stands outside the prison gates and who shouts on high for freedom. And you kept the case alive on so many media, and I think we should all be grateful to you as well. And to you, Mohamed, just know that we will all be with you. You go to Canada, you may be the only Canadian journalist who goes to a hockey game with your lawyers. but I hope all of us will follow the Fahmy Foundation, because in helping your foundation, we will help many other journalists. And may you and Marwa have the sweetest Canadian Thanksgiving ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I want to thank Amal very much, because what happened, what you did for me in Egypt was very important, and it really did help a lot. And my wife as well, she was so supportive, and she's done for me what they always ask me if you had a hero, and I always said no, I don't have any heroes, but now she is my hero. I think I'm here because I have, two very powerful women who are behind me. Very lucky guy.